The village of Ashford had always whispered secrets about the Ember Wastes, a desolate expanse, scorched by ancient fires so fierce they had left the ground cracked and barren. No crops grew there, and no bird dared sing in its lifeless air. Parents warned their children of the cursed land beyond the ash-colored hills, telling tales spun from the fading memories of dragons, magnificent creatures whose massive forms ruled the skies long ago before vanishing mysteriously centuries past. For most, these dragons were nothing more than dusty myths, stories to entertain and frighten, memories swallowed by the relentless march of time. But in the heart of Ashford, those embers of legend still glowed faintly, burning bright enough to guide a few with restless souls. One such soul was Rion, a young blacksmith's apprentice of 17 summers, whose dreams had long been haunted by a single, flickering ember glowing defiantly against an endless night. Rion was nothing extraordinary on the surface, harboring soot-stained hands and eyes sharpened by the glare of the forge. His master, old Bram, had only one lesson for him: craft well and speak little. The world doesn't care for dreams or fancy tales, Bram often grumbled, hammering a glowing sword on the anvil. Yet Rion felt the ember's pulse beneath his ribs, a warmth and a whisper he could neither forge nor forget. It grew with every quiet evening, threading its way through his thoughts like the smoke winding skyward. Some nights, when the village had fallen silent, Rion would sneak to the edge of the wasteland, staring into the barren stretch where the glow flickered, a beacon only he seemed to see. The ember's light called to him with an urgency that defied reason, carrying a name lost to time and a promise only he could understand. It was on a night glazed with frost and silver stars that Rion's restraint finally broke. He slipped away from the warmth of the smithy and ventured forth, heart pounding against his ribs as he crossed the boundary where the earth was blackened and cracked, the air heavy with the scent of smoke and old magic. The Ember Wastes were alive with a faint, otherworldly glow, the ground shimmering with hues of orange and red that danced like the breath of fallen dragons. Each cautious step deepened Rion's awe and fear, the cold night air biting at his skin, yet unable to quell the ember's flame within him. Suddenly, amidst the cracked earth, a sound shattered the stillness, a low, ragged gasp, filled with pain and desperation. Rion's breath caught, muscles tensed as he scanned the shadows ahead. There, collapsing among the scorched stones, lay a creature beyond his wildest dreams. It was a dragon, but not the monstrous terror of old tales. Its scales shimmered like molten gold, fractured and dulled by wounds. Great wings, folded but vast, bore the marks of battle and wear. The dragon's eyes, fierce and ancient, held not rage, but a profound sorrow and a silent plea. The air shimmered with heat despite the cool night, the dragon's breath a thin ribbon of smoke curling upward. Rion's hands trembled, but did not move away. This creature, thought extinct for generations, was alive, vulnerable, and bound by some unspoken destiny to this young human. "Help me," the dragon rasped, its voice a fragile echo of smoke and ash. Its gaze bore into Rion's, the ember within him flaring in response, as if recognizing a kindred spark. Rion knelt slowly, heart thrumming in shock and wonder. The bond forged this night would alter the course of many lives, his own and that of the dying breed before him. The last ember of a forgotten world had found hope in human hands. He did not yet understand the full weight of his choice, but the path was lit one step, and the ember's call would never let him turn away again. And so, beneath the watchful stars and cracked earth, the legend began anew. Rion's mind raced as he reached out a tentative hand, brushing a clawed forelimb against the coarse earth. The dragon's body was warm, a furnace barely contained beneath golden scales cracked and flecked with ash. Despite the creature's size, its breath skimmed shallow and uneven, broken shards of life still clinging fiercely to existence. "You're hurt worse than I imagined," Rion whispered, the forge's lessons echoing as his hands instinctively sought to soothe rather than craft. "Hold on, I'll find a way." The dragon's amber eyes flickered with a hopeful light before dimming again. "I'm called Varathus," it said, voice a brittle ember struggling to ignite. Guardian of the last flame. Rion's breath caught. For a boy who had only known the hammer and anvil, words like these forged new realities, ancient legacies spoken in a whisper meant only for him to hear. "Why come to me?" Rian asked, all pushing aside fear. "Because you can carry the ember, the hope that no other can," Varathis rasped. "The flame is dying. The world forgets us. But in your blood lies the spark of revival, the enormity of the moment pressed down, a weight heavier than any metal blade Rian had yet molded. Yet beneath the fear, something fierce rose, a resolute courage born from a call deeper than instinct, a responsibility he never chose, but could neither deny. Rian stumbled back, searching the barren wasteland for signs of life or aid. Alone, he was barely a boy. With a dragon's fate entwined to his own, he would need more than fists or fire. Over the following days, Rian returned to his modest cottage, secreted Varathis in a hidden cavern, shielded by ancient rock and earth magic whispered in village folktales. He scavenged herbs and bandages from the forest outskirts, applying gentle care to the dragon's wounds, learning the rhythms of its breathing, and absorbing tales of ages past with each labored breath. Varathis spoke of a time when dragons soared freely, their fires protecting the realms from shadow and cold. He recounted battles with dark forces that sought to extinguish their flames, and how sacrifice had led to their near extinction. His words painted vivid pictures of majesty and sorrow, of power and duty, qualities now past, yet awaiting rebirth. As the days waned, a strange kinship blossomed. Rian found his dreams filled with visions of fire and flight, of ancient magic pulsing through veins long thought dormant. The ember within him burned brighter, a beacon guiding not only Rian, but the very fate of a dying world. Yet danger lurked beyond the borders. Not all embraced the return of dragons, and ancient enemies, long hidden, stirred with malice. Whispers of betrayal and war whispered on the winds, carrying threats that could snuff out the fragile ember before it was fully kindled. One night, as the twin moons cast pale light across the wasteland, Rian sat beside Varathis, listening to the steady rhythm of its breathing. The bond between boy and dragon was no longer forged in fear, but in hope, a pact unspoken, sealed by fire and trust. "You must promise me," Varathis said quietly, "that this ember will never be allowed to die, that you will rise when others fall and carry the light into the darkness." Rian nodded, the weight of destiny settling on his shoulders like the anvil's press. "I promise." Beyond the silent horizon, stars flickered in ancient patterns, watching as a new chapter kindled in the forge of fate, a story of ember, courage, and the fire reborn in human hands. And so, the journey truly began. Dawn broke over Ashford, with a hush that felt almost reverent, as if the sky itself held its breath while light bled through the seam of the world. The first rays brushed the ember wastes, turning the ash-scored plains into a sea of dull copper and emerald glass. Rian stood on the fringe of that sea, feeling the tiny warmth within his chest, answering the sun's arrival, like a coal learning again what it means to be fire. He carried linen, salves, and a basket of clean water-humble offerings for a creature whose shadow had once shrouded kingdoms. Varathis waited in the cavern's mouth, golden scales dulled by injury, yet unmistakably regal, like a fallen crown that still held the memory of a king. Each breath the dragon took rasped over a pain that Rian could not forge away, but he could tend to it with patience and presence. His hands moved carefully over those rent seams between plates of scale, where living heat bled out in soft steam and smoke, sealing with poultices made of pine resin, weed, and crushed star moss old bram kept for burns. "You have the hands of a maker," Varathis murmured, voice thin but steady. "Makers are kin to flame." Rian wanted to laugh at that bram's voice lived in his ear, warning him how quickly flame punished pride, but the ember inside him flared in quiet agreement. He had always loved mending what was broken, drawing out shape from stubborn ore. Perhaps this, too, was making. When the tending was done, Rian rested with his back to warm stone. "You said I could carry the ember. Why me?" Varathis's eyes were lamps in dimness, banked and seeing. "Because the ember answers will, not blood. Human will changes the shape of the world. It is why your kind endures storms that break mountains." Rian felt it then not flattery, but a truth laid gently in his hands, as if to see whether he would accept its weight. "If I carry it," he said, "what does it ask?" "Memory," Varathis answered. "Courage, the discipline to kindle without consuming. To be flame that warms, not fire that devours. Outside the cavern, the village was waking into rumors. Shapes moved along the road like questions. Rion's name rode between teeth that had never noticed him before. Old Bram found him near noon by the water trough beside the smithy, where the world was still iron and task and honest heat. "Boy," Bram said, though the word no longer fit a brittle thing trying to mask care. "There's talk, fool talk. Hunters from the hillstead. A tithe man with a long memory and a longer ledger. Says he's got writs from the old days when Dragonbone fetched coin enough to buy a crown." Rian swallowed. He had learned the grammar of men like the tithe man. Justify the cutting by naming it harvest. "I'm busy," Rian said, smoothing a bar of raw iron with a file to give his shaking hand something exact to do. Bram watched him, weathered eyes narrowing. "I taught you to blow air to where the coal is dulling. I did not teach you to pour oil on fear." The anvil wore the conversation like a scar. Rian set down the file. "There's a dragon," he said plainly. "He is hurt. If they come, they'll kill him." Bram's jaw worked, grief and anger quenching and flashing in turn. "And if he burns your thatch and eats your neighbors, you will still defend him with your soft hands." "He isn't what the stories say," Rian replied. "And even if he were, doesn't the one who bleeds deserve a bandage?" Bram breathed out a slow hiss, the sound of iron meeting water. "You argue like a priest," he muttered. "Priests send others to do the bleeding." Rian met his gaze. "I will be there." Something in that answer moved in Bram's face like old ice cracking. He nodded once, unwilling to bless, unable to forbid. "Then be there before the men with hooks and ledgers. And if you must light flame, mind how high it climbs." That evening, Rian returned to the cavern with a rope, blankets, and a plan he did not trust but would enact. He taught Varathis the path along the basalt shelves, where the cliff face shouldered wind and hid tracks in shadow. Each pause was a lesson in breathing. Each breath was a promissory note written to the next. "They will come at dusk or before dawn," Rian said. "Fear makes men arrive either too late or too early." Varathis's gaze turned toward the village lanterns pricking the dark. "Fear arrives exactly when it is fed," the dragon said quietly. He lowered his head, bringing old gold close to young flesh. "Listen to me. The last flame does not live in me alone. It lives where it is chosen. If I fall, and the ember has not yet taken root in you, the world will keep forgetting until forgetting is all it knows." Rian set a hand against a warm scale, feeling the substructure of a being built for sky. "Then let it take root," he said. "Let it find good soil." Night lowered its veil. In Ashford, the alehouse grew noisy with men who spoke bravely to their cups. On the ridge, 3 figures paused to cut strips of cloth for their faces, practiced the throw of a barbed line, and rehearsed the sound a hero makes when he calls a duty. In the cavern, Rian counted his fear the way Bram had taught him to count hammer blows, measured, purposeful, each one shaping the next. He banked a lantern until it was barely aglow. He tried his promise on his tongue like a new-made blade. "I will not let you die," he said, and the ember inside him answered not with heat, but with a clear, bright calm. "Then," Varathis said, matching his breathing to the boys, "we will begin." Outside, a fox barked sharp and distant, and every star above the wastes seemed to tilt just slightly to listen. They came on the edge of celebration, because fear prefers a crowd. Ashford's Festival of Stars was a small thing born of long winter's lanterns strewn like constellations along the square. Sugared dough so children would remember sweetness. Old songs retuned to whatever year had given and taken. Tonight, the lanterns felt like watchfires. The sky poured itself into clear, cold blue-black, and breath made ghosts in front of mouths. Rian threaded through the gathering in plain clothes and purpose, tasting how a promise changes the way a body moves. He had hidden a coil of rope near the well, and mapped in his mind the angles between alleys, doors, and sightlines, the way he mapped the grain in iron before the first strike. On the ridge trail, Varathis had practiced taking weight on the least injured limbs, folding his wings just so. If they had to flee, they would aim for the basalt shelf and the old creek run, where stone remembered how to be secret. But sometimes safety is not a place. Sometimes it is a decision set like a keystone in the arch of a night. The tithe man arrived with 2 huntsmen, and a certainty that smelled like law and rot. He wore a cloak the color of spilled ink, and a smile made for contracts. Good people, he said, palms outward as if blessing them. There is a matter of public safety. A shiver moved through the crowd, a school of fish turning in one motion beneath a shadow. Old Bram stood with arms like beams, set wide across his chest. The baker's wife pulled her children close under her shawl. Rian felt the ember tap at his ribs. He stepped forward. What safety is threatened? He asked, and his voice surprised him clear, pitched to carry, not angry. The tithe man tilted his head, reading the boy as he might read an invoice. Dragons devour, dragons hoard, dragons burn. The writs are older than your father's bones, he said, drawing a stiff parchment that rasped like dry leaves. By crown and council, any sign of draconic presence within 10 miles of a chartered settlement is to be reported and resolved. A team has been retained for resolution. He did not say killing. Men like him hired verbs that kept their boots clean. Murmur became tide. 3 hunters and piecemeal males shifted, their eyes already walking the edge of town, noses tasting wind. Rian thought of barbed lines, of cloth masks, of how fear practiced itself until it was efficient. If a dragon devoured, we would have bones, Rian said, pacing his words like blows on hot iron. If a dragon hoarded, we would have missing coin. If a dragon burned, we would have ash. We have none of these. He opened his hands. What we have is a choice, to make an enemy from an old story, or a neighbor from a new truth. He felt each sentence strike and ring. He felt the ember answer, with a widening of light that did not scorch. The tithe man's smile thinned. And you, apprentice, how would you know such things? Rian did not lie, but he did not betray. Because I know what broken breath sounds like, he said. Because I know a fever when I see one. Because I know that killing an injured thing is not safety. It is cowardice dressed in ink. The word cowardice moved through the square like a spark lifting from a coal. Some flinched, some straightened. Hunters do not like that word. One stepped forward, scar along his jaw white as chalk. Boy, he said, meaning to tuck Rian back into a place with small voices. Step aside. Old Bram's hammer hand lifted, not to strike, but to point. If the boy steps aside, a man will stand where he stood, Bram said. His voice carried a lifetime. Pick one, and one more, and one more. There will be no end to it. For a breath, the square balanced. Varathis, listening from stone and shadow beyond the last houses, tasted the air. He had intended to remain unseen. He had intended to let the boy's courage suffice. But sometimes the right temperature must be reached before metal yields. The dragon stepped into sight at the far edge of the square, wounded, immense, incandescent in restraint. Gasps broke like surf. He did not roar. He lowered himself, wings tucked, head bowed not in subservience, but in chosen gentleness. Flame licked his teeth and stopped there, disciplined as a soldier at attention. I am Varathis, he said, voice filling rafters and ribs. I come not to devour or to hoard, but to ask that your memory be larger than your fear. Fire watches from the harvest years would be told and retold about that hush. The tithe man's throat worked. He had come to deal in ledgers. He had not priced posture. One hunter loosed a barbed line out of habit, fear running faster than thought. Rian moved before the line learned how to fly. He caught the throw arc with his rope, yanked hard, and the barb bit into the well's stone lip instead of scale. Pain flowered in his palms, like a new sun. Varathis exhaled a fan of heat straight-up signal, not strike painting the sky with a banner of controlled flame that turned every face to warm gold. Look, Rian shouted into the glow, voice raw with certainty. This is power that can choose. The square saw it then, not told but shown, flame bridled, might on a leash held from within. A woman near the front, whose father had died in a barn fire that had nothing to do with dragons, lowered her knife. The baker's wife took her children's hands out from under the shawl. Bram bowed an inch, which from him was a league. For the tithe man, the moment was dangerous. Hope changes margins. He folded his parchment. This, he said, each syllable counted, is irregular. So are miracles. Bram answered. The huntsman shifted, measuring odds in a square that no longer wished to be a battlefield. The night, at last, breathed. Varathis lifted his head, met 100 mortal eyes, and did not look away. I will leave your roofs unburned, he said. I will leave your flocks undisturbed. I will take nothing you do not freely give. He turned slightly, letting the lantern light show jagged rents along his flank. If you know the look of a wound, then know this. I am not the danger here. Rian took one step to stand beside the dragon's forelimb. He did not touch. Respect is also restraint, but he spoke where the silence would carry him. Fear brought hooks, he said. Let memory bring bandages. Somewhere in the back, someone began to move toward home, toward clean cloth, toward a different ending. It did not redeem the world. It did not finish the story, but it set the keystone. Under a sky blown wide with stars, Ashford chose for one night to warm its hands at a flame that did not burn. And the ember within a human chest learned a new shape for blaze, not conquest, but consent. Morning found Ashford quieter than it had any right to be after a night like that. The sky wore a rinsed blue, the kind that makes roofs look newly thatched and rivers honest. People moved as if each step might ring, careful with the newness they were carrying. A dragon had bowed his head in their square and had not burned them. A boy had spoken like a bell. The world had not ended. It had tilted. Rian rose from a sleep that hadn't been sleep so much as brief forgiveness from exhaustion. The ember inside him felt steadier now, not a trembling coal, but a patient heart fire. He flexed his bandaged palms, raw maps of the choice he had made, and listened to the day as Bram had taught him. What is loud? What is missing? What is out of true? Birds returned to the hedges. The gossip out front of the baker's no longer used the words devour and hoard like punctuation. It used the word if, which is how hope first arrives, tentative, conditional, negotiating its rate. He made his way to the cavern with a basket heavy in the way that feeds. Boiled roots, smoked river fish, a heel of bread, clean cloth. On the ridge he paused. The wastes lay open and unashamed. Yesterday's fear burned off like fog. He did not need the lantern at his belt anymore. Daylight went ahead of him and held the doors. Varathis lay where stone remembered his shape, eyes half-lidded, smoke writing a slow script from his nostrils. He looked less like a fallen crown today, and more like a king who had decided to sit among his people. You have the stance, Varathis said without preface, voice warmed by rest, of one who is about to be asked for things. Rian set the basket down. They will come, he said, thinking of the tithe man's narrowed arithmetic, with questions, with bargains, with problems they will call emergencies. And you? Varathis asked. I will answer what I can, and I will say no where no is needed. He hesitated. Is that carrying the ember? It is learning where to place it, said the dragon. A fire set in a hearth warms a house. The same fire on the floor ruins it. They ate their different meals in companionable quiet. When Varathis closed his eyes, Rian traced without touching the root of a jag along the dragon's flank and thought about metals, how some scars were not to be erased, but to be inlaid, filled with a different shine. In the forge, Bram sometimes mended cracked blades with a seam of brass that made the weakness into a line of light. The blade did not forget. It learned a new kind of strength. By mid-morning, villagers began to appear not as a mob, but as a procession of ordinary needs. The shepherd came with worry about a lambing shed too near the ridge. A miller's son brought a jar of honey and a question about whether dragons dream. The baker, with her hands still dusted in flour, asked if there was a way to keep the ovens from cracking in winter. Heat was a craft, after all, and perhaps it could be taught. Bram arrived last, moving like a weather front, a sack over his shoulder, and an expression set to practical. You spoke, he said to Rian with no ceremony. Now you will do? He set down the sack, tongs, a peen hammer, files in their roll, 3 lengths of raw iron bar. Bram tilted his head at Varathis. If you are to be near, you may as well be of use. Varathis's eyes sparked. Teach me the language of your heat, he said. I have known only mine. So a forge was built in the mouth of the world's oldest kill. They dug a shallow pit and lined it with stone, banked coals from Ashford's longest burning hearth, and brought the bellows that wheezed like a very old dog but still obeyed. Varathis watched the way men convinced air to kneel and serve, the way iron confessed its secrets under rhythm. When Rian laid the first bar, and Bram nodded him to strike, Varathis listened to the ring and understood something profound. Human making was a negotiation with stubbornness, not a conquest of it. Flame was invited, contained, and thanked. If I heat this, Rian asked, without looking up, will you hold it steady for me? Varathis lowered his great head, exhaled until the coals answered, then drew the heat back inside with a discipline that made Bram grunt in what might have been admiration. Rian lifted the bar to the anvil and struck. The ember inside him timed the blows, one for will, one for memory, one for mercy. A shape emerged that was not quite tool and not quite symbol, a hook that could lift without tearing, a curve that redirected force, a notch to catch a barbed line and turn it. By noon, they had a small array of new answers to old problems, a hinge that would not seize in frost, a stove baffle that gave more heat for less wood, a shepherd's crook whose curve learned from dragon talons how to hold without harm. People left the cavern with their hands fuller than when they had come, and their eyes less certain that fear was the only honest teacher. After the rush of needs ebbed, quiet returned like a tide, coming back to claim its own. Rian sat, palms up, feeling the throb under the bandages ease into a steady pulse. "What is the last flame, exactly?" he asked. "Not the story. What is it to you?" Varathis's pupils narrowed to slits and widened as if focusing past the stone, past the hill, into something a memory could not entirely hold. "It is the agreement," he said at last, "between what devours and what endures, between hunger and hearth. Long ago, we dragons swore to be the standing heat at the world's edge, to keep the night from taking back what they had built. But we began to love our own heat more than the houses it warmed. We forgot to ask for consent." Rian looked at his hands, at the iron filings glittering in his lifelines. "Then perhaps the last flame is a promise to ask." Varathis inclined his head. "Perhaps it is." The light lengthened. At the mouth of the cavern, a figure had been waiting, unmoving enough to be mistaken for stone, until shadow peeled back. The tithe man, alone. He stepped in with the posture of one who believes entering is the same as owning. "I have revised my ledgers," he said, voice mild, eyes keen. "There is coin to be made from a dragon who does not kill. There are patrons who prefer their monsters docile. We may come to terms." Rian stood. The ember brightened, not toward anger, but toward a clarity that would not be bought. "We are not for sale." The tithe man smiled, the kind a knife might make if it learned to move lips. "Everything is for sale, apprentice. It is only a question of what it costs you to learn it." He glanced at Varathis. "I will return with a contract. Refuse if you like, but markets do not take no as an answer. They take it as an opening." He left the way a shadow leaves, less by moving than by being outlasted. Rian found that his hands were steady. Varathis's were not hands, but the great talons flexed once, slowly. "There will be other hunters," the dragon said, "not with hooks and lines, with ink, with applause, with crowns." Rian nodded. "Then we will learn to catch those too." The first test came not with spears, but with song. Ashford's Festival of Stars resumed the following night, as if the village had decided that daring calm was braver than staging a siege. The square glittered. Lanterns hung thick as fruit. A troop of minstrels arrived from the riverway, drawn by rumor and offered coin by someone who wanted the narrative played out loud. Their leader wore a coat sewn with mirrored glass and fingers heavy with rings. His eyes were bright with hunger of a social kind. He bowed with a flourish to the crowd, and then, ostentatiously, to the suggestion of a dragon out by the ridge. "Friends," he cried, "we bring the Ballad of the Last Dragon and the Boy of Ash, newly composed, guaranteed to rhyme with your better selves." Laughter warmed the air. Rian felt the embers stiffen inside him. Music could carry truth like a ship, but it could also launder a lie until it looked clean. The song began simple, as good snares do. A boy with coal on his hands, a wounded beast, a promise. But by the second verse, the beast had become a pet and the boy a tamer. By the bridge, the dragon was a mount to be saddled. By the final refrain, the crowd was invited to sing a command. "Bow, bow, bright flame, to the keeper of your name." It was catchy. That was the danger. Consent could be stolen by a chorus if no one stood against it. Rian stepped forward before the encore could harden the tale. His voice did not compete. It cut. "Sing a different verse," he said, and the square stilled, because boys do not address troops like that in villages like this. "Sing one where power bows to no leash, but its own choosing. Sing one where help is help, not ownership dressed as care." The minstrel's smile tightened at the edges. "Art," he said lightly, "gives people what they want. Then show them how to want better, Rian replied. He turned to the crowd, palms out, bandages stark in lantern light. If we put reins on this, we will make it small and call it safety. But what we will have killed is not the dragon. It is the thing in us that could have been larger. Murmur moved again, but differently, now lower, a current under a boat. An old woman near the well lifted her chin and sang, off-key and strong, a line no one had written for her. Flame that chooses, we choose you. It was not pretty. It did not need to be. Others joined because that is how a counter-melody is born. The minstrel's show unraveled, not in humiliation, but in refusal to be simplified. At the ridge, Varathis listened with a stillness the size of mountains. He felt the tug of the crowd's first song, the way it would turn him into a bright tool. He felt the correction arrive from those who had seen a controlled blaze and understood that choosing is the holiest part of power. When the minstrels packed up with dignity and thinner purses, the tithe man reappeared, flanked now by a woman in a city-cut cloak and a sigil ring that made silence when it caught light. Envoy, he said, gesturing, from the council. She spoke with the calm of someone used to walking in combustible rooms. We have seen wars started by less, she said, not unkindly. Here is our offer, sanctuary in the old quarry, under charter protection, formal recognition as a civic asset of unusual nature, a stipend for upkeep. In return, supervised appearances, designated no-fly zones, limitations on fire use within settlements, and an advisory board to oversee. Narrative? Her pause was surgical. Your village would prosper. Your dragon would be safe. Your boy would be famous. Rian looked at Varathis before he answered. He had learned something about fame from how the minstrel's chorus felt on his skin. I will not be famous, he said. I will be useful, and he will be free. The envoy did not bristle. She evaluated. Freedom without terms is war by another name, she said softly. Choose carefully which cages you refuse. Some are built to keep enemies out, not creatures in. Varathis lowered his head until the envoy could see her own reflection in the banked gold of his eye. If I agree to limits, he said, it must be because I choose them, and may unchoose if the purpose is betrayed, not because your story requires me to be safe for purchase. Silence spun fine as glass. The envoy inclined her head a fraction. Consent, then, written. She slid a parchment forward with clauses written in a hand that had never chopped wood. Read. Amend. We will sign, or we will not. Bram took the parchment in his big hands like it was a dull blade that could still cut wrong. We will read, he said. We will amend. The night wore on toward decision. Rian and Varathis stepped aside where lantern light thinned to starlight. I do not know law, Rian said. Only heat, and where to put it. You know enough, Varathis replied. You know that the ember is not spectacle. It is stewardship. He looked up where the cosmos burned cold and innumerable. If I am to be bound, let it be to a promise I would have made even if no one had asked. Rian breathed, long and slow. Then we bind ourselves first, he said, to what we said the night I promised. He unwrapped his palms and held them out. Varathis lowered a talon, the size of a scythe, very, very carefully, until it touched skin without breaking it. They did not speak a vow. They remembered it. The ember answered in both, not hotter, but wider. When they returned to the table, Bram had already carved through 3 clauses and rewritten them in words that would make sense to a cooper or a cook. The envoy read, considered, and marked the margins with small notes that did not argue so much as clarify. By the time the last lantern guttered, there was a draft that did something rare. It made room for a living thing to remain alive. The council would not love it. Markets would not adore it. But Ashford, for now, could defend it. Tomorrow, the envoy said. Ink and seals. She looked to Rian, then to Varathis. And a beginning that is not a cage. When the square emptied, the fox barked again out on the wastes. The sound was the same as before, and not the same at all. Rian stood with Bram and the dragon in the everyone after a choice, where the world waits to see if the heat will hold. At dawn, the envoy returned with ink, seals, and a quiet that meant she had argued all night and won only the right to keep arguing. Behind her came 2 clerks with travel-stiff hands and eyes that measured edges. The tithe man shadowed them like a smudge that refused soap. Ashford met them not with fanfare, but with benches, bread, and a table. Bram had planed himself brought out into the square as if a treaty were just another piece of work to be done well. Varathis approached at a pace that made every heartbeat a witness. He did not loom. He arrived. Rian walked beside him, bandages clean, palms pink with new skin, carrying a small box. Inside lay a quill shaved from a goose's feather, and another made of hammered bronze, with a slit so it could drink ink like rain. Consent should use tools that would not fail at a crucial stroke. The envoy set the parchment down. In daylight, the contract looked less like a snare and more like a bridge with many cautious planks. "For the record," she said, and one clerk poised his pen, "name and nature. I am Varathis, guardian of the last flame," the dragon said. "I am not an asset. I am a person of a different kind." The clerk wrote person of a different kind and underlined different twice, as if to keep it from wandering. The envoy's mouth almost smiled. Bram cleared his throat. "We move clause by clause," he said, as if ordering students to sweep a shop floor. "We say what we mean. We do not leave room for a clever man to mean otherwise." So they did. They turned words like stones in a river, looking for slickness. Supervised appearances became invited appearances. No-fly zones became agreed-upon corridors of respect. Limitations on fire use gained the phrase, "except in defense of life," in which case discretion rests with Varathis. The advisory board to oversee narrative was renamed the Circle of Witnesses and given no power but to listen, to record, and to warn if any party forgot what had been promised. Rian watched the envoy as changes accreted. She did not flinch at the erosion of control. She did not snarl at the loss of tidy lines. When she argued, it was for clarity, not capture. Once, quietly, when the tithe man reached to draw a clause back to his shape, she placed 2 fingers on the parchment and said, "No." It was not loud. It did not need to be. By midday, the bridge of words could bear weight. Bram fetched a pot of stew. The clerks ate like men who had discovered that hunger could be a tool and a tyranny. They chose to leave it unused for a meal. The tithe man ate by himself, chewing like negotiation. "Before we sign," Rian said, lifting the little bronze quill, "one more clause." He looked to Varathis, who nodded. "Consent may be withdrawn." He felt the square shift, as if wind had changed, by either party, with cause stated, with time given to mend what can be mended, with the understanding that leaving is not failure, when staying would be a lie. The envoy's eyes warmed a fraction. "At it," she said. The tithe man made a sound like a nail bent wrong. No one hammered it flat. They signed. Varathis pressed his talons fine-tipped to ink and then to parchment with a care that made breath catch. Rian set his name not as an owner, but as a witness and a keeper of promises. Bram scrawled like weather across a field. The envoy's seal bit wax and left the sigil of a city that could be fair when it remembered how. When it was done, the square did not cheer. It exhaled. The world had taken one step and the floor had held. News ran faster than any horse. By evening, riders brought word that caravans would divert to see the dragon who had signed. A monastery up the river sent a letter in ink the color of river mud, offering to house a scriptorium for the circle of witnesses. A lordling from the east sent a messenger with a gift, a collar of gilded iron too small to fit around. Varathis's foreleg, and therefore meant for Rian's neck. Bram threw it down the old well and spat after it as if to salt the earth in that hole. "Fame is a clever hunter," Varathis said, eyeing the horizon where dust meant traffic. "It does not stalk with feet. It arrives by invitation." Rian turned the bronze quill in his fingers. "Then we will invite what we can feed and send the rest away hungry." For a time, it worked. The quarry under charter protection became not a cage, but a classroom and a council fire. Farmers came to learn how to set till heat so pots would not crack. Sailors came to study wind with a creature who had ridden it. Children came with the polite, serious questions of the unafraid. Varathis answered as one who remembered being feared and chose to be useful instead. But the world beyond Ashford had teeth. Where consent builds, control plots. In a city whose sigils could not restrain greed, a prince who loved pageantry more than people heard of a dragon who bowed to a contract and thought, "At last, a show that will make my rivals applaud and my enemies swallow their envy like poison." He sent couriers with velvet tongues and iron schedules. He sent invitations wrapped like commands. The envoy intercepted what she could. "He will try to make you a spectacle," she warned. handing Rian a packet of letters that smelled like money. The contract protects you within our jurisdiction. His festivals will claim to be outside it. Then we do not go, Rian said. Varathis shifted, scales whispering like many small truths. Sometimes refusing is the show, he murmured. Sometimes the bravest thing is to arrive and refuse there. Rian met his gaze. If we go with our terms. We go to teach. We leave if turned into parade. Bram snorted. And you will bring a hammer to a court that thinks paper is iron. He jerked his head toward the forge. And make something the paper cannot bind. They made a standard, not a banner for war, but a sign for choice. A staff of ashwood capped with a bronze quill, from which hung a rectangle of undyed linen stitched with a single symbol in soot-black thread, an open hand with a flame resting in the palm, not consuming it. The circle of witnesses stitched their names on the hem. When raised, it meant this: consent present, consent required. 2 days later, they rode. The prince's city announced itself in the way of places that have forgotten hunger too long. Gates high as pride, guards coiffed as if the enemy were boredom, streets so clean they had never learned to grieve. Pennants burned color into the air. Music happened at corners the way puddles happen in rain. They were received with courtesies shaped like leashes. Pages bowed and measured. A chancellor's assistant assigned them quarters that opened onto a courtyard with gates that could close very fast. Rian set the standard in the doorway like a third presence. Varathis lay in the yard and made the stone look small. An audience was arranged for the following day in the Sun Hall, a room built to teach eyes to look up. The prince entered late enough to be admired, wearing a cloak wired with tiny mirrors that caught every shard of flame. He was handsome the way a mask is handsome, symmetrical, uncanny, hollow, where a person ought to be deep. Welcome, he said, spreading arms as if embracing a crowd that might hesitate. Ashford's boy of brave heart, Varathis, flame of legend. Today we show the world how old fear can be made safe. Rian lifted the standard so the symbol faced the throne. Old fear can be made useful, he corrected in a tone that could have shot a horse, but not safe for purchase. The prince's smile did not falter. People who have practiced control cannot imagine a world where it is not the floor. A demonstration then, he said, flicking 2 fingers. Servants wheeled in a contraption of mirrors and lenses and polished. Brass and apparatus that could split a candle's light into a rainbow, could magnify a flicker into spectacle. Paint the sky, he said to Varathis. We have trained the air to hold your fire in pictures. Varathis looked at the machine, at the animals who had harnessed light, and then taught it tricks. He glanced at Rian. Rian touched the hem of the linen where names were stitched. I paint by invitation, Varathis said, and by purpose. What is your purpose? To delight, said the prince without a blink. To awe, to gather acclaim. All is not owned, Varathis replied. He turned his great head to the gallery where city folk had gathered to watch. Do you wish to be awed? They did, honestly. People seldom refuse honest awe. Varathis exhaled not fire, but heat without flame. The air rippled, the lenses shivered, the mirrors fogged with sudden warmth. Then he drew the heat back until the glass cleared, and on each mirror, instead of flame, there was written a word by the hand of steam. Ask. It faded, but not before every person in the gallery read it and understood enough to be irritated by the understanding. The prince applauded, 3 precise claps that sounded like the beginning of a punishment. We will do the real demonstration this evening, he said. At the river, a flotilla has been prepared. The people expect a show. After, in their courtyard, the chancellor came a woman whose hair had made up its mind to be gray without help. She stood in the doorway and looked at the standard before she looked at the dragon. He will try to corner you, she said, the way a farmer tells you what the sky is doing. He will put you on water and surround you with boats so that you must breathe fire straight up to avoid killing anyone. Then he will photograph the pillar as if it were his, her mouth flattened. He will say the contract is not binding here. Rian felt the ember draw long inside him like a bowstring. Then we will bind it with something that reaches farther than ink. At dusk, the flotilla pulled like a necklace across the river's throat. Lanterns hung from masts in mathematical beauty. The prince stood on a prow, arms flared to own the horizon. Crowds lined the banks with open mouths, ready to be fed a story made sugar-sweet. Rian took the standard and walked to the water's edge. Varathis waited until the river climbed his shoulders. The current leaned against him like a large dog. "People of the city," Rian called, and his voice traveled as if the river chose to carry it. "We came because we were invited, and we brought our terms where all could see them. You will not be made smaller by asking before you ask for more." He lifted the linen, the flame in hand, black upon evening. "Consent present. Consent required." The prince laughed, bright and contemptuous. "Consent?" he called. "You have mine. Perform." "That is not how it works," Rian said, and the river said it with him, and the people felt the weight of a new grammar on their tongues. The prince flicked his hand. Drummers struck. Signal flags rose. The flotilla tightened as planned until iron logic fenced the dragon in. Varathis looked up. He could have sent a pillar to the stars. He did not. Instead, he sank. Gasps scattered along the banks like spooked birds. The water, for a terrible second, went still. Then it bulged and rolled as heat convected under the surface. A great silent engine turning. Fish broke water and did not die. Reeds bent and did not char. A fog rose thick, warm, immediate, that swallowed lanterns, flags, pride. Boats drifted blind, their timbers swelling as if remembering trees. In the fog, Rian's voice came from everywhere at once. "We do not perform for commands. We perform for purpose. Your purpose is applause. Ours is covenant." The fog wrote itself on the air the way steam had written itself on mirrors. Ask, consent, leave room. By the time the fog thinned, the flotilla was scattered against both banks like spilled beads. No one was dead. No one was burned. Many were very wet. The prince stood on his prow, with hair that had never prepared to be humble. He did not know where to put his hands. The crowd, some of them laughed, not at humiliation, but at the sheer audacity of a refusal that had made beauty instead of wreckage. The chancellor bowed from the quay, as if a lesson had landed intact. "I will write," she mouthed to Rian, tapping the standard symbol with 2 fingers soldiers sign for respect given and received. That night, in quarters with doors that still could have closed too fast, Rian sat with the ember wide as a hearth inside him. Varathis lay like a hill that had learned how to breathe. "We will not be invited back," Rian said. "We were never invited," Varathis replied, a smile in smoke. "We were summoned. It is different." Rian leaned his head back against stone that remembered heat. "Then we returned to those who asked." "Not yet," Varathis said, tilting his head toward the dark beyond the wall. On the far side of the courtyard, a shadow stepped away from shadow. It moved like a question that hoped to be an answer. "You shamed a prince," the figure said, voice roughened by miles. "Good. Now come meet the ones who have no princes, only winter." They heard a dragon signed a contract. They wonder if a dragon might sign a promise with them, to bring fire where the sun forgets to visit. Rian stood. Varathis rose. The standard lifted. The ember stretched itself toward a new purpose, like a flame learning a new language. They traveled north into a geography built by absence. Roads forgot themselves under frost. Trees huddled as if sharing rumors of a harder sky. The messenger who had stepped from shadow named no prince, only a people, the Frostreach. Their villages were not on maps, because winter prefers not to be seen. For 3 days, they followed the messenger's pace, a glide more than a walk, conserving heat like a prayer. Rian learned to sleep in short, deep pockets, and to read snow the way he read iron, by grain, by give, by the story pressed into it, by pressure and time. Varathis traveled above when the wind held gentle, and on the ground when it did not, his weight distributing across ice, like a promise not to break what keeps you alive. On the 4th day, ice fog parted as if someone had parted a curtain, and a village appeared, roofs banked in snow, doorways curtained with reindeer hide, aurora nailed to the sky with stars. Children stood in boots furred to the thigh and looked at the dragon as if he were a relative they had been told stories about, but never expected to meet. No one screamed. Fear has different work to do in places like this. The elder came with a gait like good rope, flexible, strong, built from many strands. She wore a circlet of woven willow and frost-seed beads that chimed when she moved. "I am Nail," she said. "We sent for you because stories reached us carrying a contract in their mouths. Will your story sign with ours?" Rian set down the standard, so the symbol faced the wind. "We sign only what we can keep," he said. What do you ask? Nail gestured to where the land bent downward into a bowl of rock and old ice. Our winter has lengthened its stride, she said. The river sleeps too long. The fish do not remember spring. The sun and the wind are quarreling. We do not need rescue. We need an ally who understands flame without arrogance. Varathis lowered himself until he and Nail breathed the same air. What would you have of me? Teach us to ask the cold to move, Nail said simply. Not to flee cold belongs here, but to shift, to let water be water again. She looked to Rian. Teach us to build kilns that breathe without eating the trees we do not have. Teach us to store summer in stones. Rian nodded as the Emperor arranged possible shapes in his mind. We can make vaults, he said, that drink heat in the long day and gift it back in the long night. We can lay pipes of clay under the meeting hall, so feet remember summer. He paused. But we will ask consent from the ground, from the river, from those who will live with what we make. Nail smiled, not politely, but like a woman recognizing kin. Good, she said. You understand we live here with things, not over them. Work began with the force that makes warmth, shared intent. The first vault would be built halfway between village and river, where basalt bones came close to the surface. Rian drew plans in ash on a hide stretched over a frame. Varathis traced air currents with smoke to show where heat would travel if invited. The villagers brought stones cut from old lava and peat bricks they guarded like books. The circle of witnesses had sent 2 of their own, an ink-handed monk with a laugh like splitting kindling and a herdswoman who wrote as she spoke, spare and precise. They recorded not to own, but to remember how to do it again without needing Rian or Varathis there. Bram arrived on the second day, surprising everyone but the sky. He had followed their tracks, as if tracking a rumor he intended to hammer true. He did not say why he'd come. He picked up a shovel. That was reason enough. They built. The vault's heart was a labyrinth of stone channels and clay tubes. During the brief noon when the sun remembered its manners, Varathis exhaled measured heat into the stone, then drew cold air through so that the stone learned the temperature of kindness, warm, not cruel. At night, the stored day bled back gently into the village, subtle as breath under a blanket. On the 4th night, snow hissed under a wind that had learned new teeth. From the ridge, knives of ice flickered in moonlight. The work, Nail said, of the whites, spirits of hunger that shaped themselves from neglect. They had thrived as winter lengthened. They did not love that a village had begun to remember how to be warm without cutting more trees than it could afford. They will test your promise, Nail said. They test all things that try to endure. Rian stood by the vault's mouth, with the standard planted as if it could grow. The whites came like shards of the moon given ideas. They whispered the grammar of frostbite. They touched the standard and recoiled not from heat, but from the idea that anyone would ask before taking. Varathis stepped forward and did the counterintuitive thing. He drew the heat inward until the air crisped and snapped. Frost feathered his whiskers. He made himself a lesson the whites could read. I can be cold too, he said into a silence that rang like glass. Heat is not my only language. The whites paused. Predators learn patterns. They do not expect a meal to change. Varathis exhaled not flame, not fog, but a tone. It was the sound the earth makes when spring pushes and rocks move and the river remembers a wake. The whites flinched as if struck, and then in unison turned and skated back to the ridge where hunger keeps its counsel. Neil's beads chimed. Consent, she said to the cold air, to her people, to the dragon. Even winter learns it when spoken correctly. By morning, the vault breathed on its own. Children left mitten prints on warm stone and giggled as heat told them it remembered their names. Elders sat with backs to the wall and cried without embarrassment because their bones had been winters long enough to deserve a gentler chair. Rian, who had never lived where Aurora stitched the sky each night, watched colors move like slow banners over a village that had learned a new word and liked how it tasted. He thought of Ashford, of the prince's fog, of the envoy's steady hand, of the tithe-man's thin smile that likely had not thinned enough. The ember widened, not to encompass the world, but to be large enough for the park he could carry without dropping. The work drew attention of a different kind. Couriers arrived not with callers, but with questions. A coastal town sent a fishwife who smelled of brine and boldness to ask about smokehouses that cured without blackening lungs. A mountain hold fast sent a mason who wanted to learn to teach granite a gentler schedule so it would not crack when the world breathed too fast. Each of them wrought gifts not of gold, but of craft, knots that did not slip, stitches that did not leak, stories told at the perfect length. In return, Arathis gave names to winds the villagers had known all their lives, but had only called cold. Rian taught the forge song to hands that had wrapped nets and held babies. Bram taught anyone who would listen how to count blows by meaning instead of number. On the 7th day, when the first vault stones had taken to their work like old friends reunited, the tithe man arrived wearing a cloak of regret, the way some men wear armor. He had ridden hard and chose not to look winded. Beside him, astonishingly, walked the envoy no retinue, boots crusted with road. Between them sat a truce, made not of liking, but of need. There has been a breach, the envoy said without throat clearing. Your prince does not enjoy being refused. He has commissioned a rival narrative, a traveling pageant with fireworks, and a mechanized dragon that does not ask, only roars on cue. They take coin and attention from villages that do not have your vault. She looked to Nail with respect, and in their wake they leave debts. The tithe man removed his gloves like a man preparing to wash more than his hands. He also bought my contract, he said, eyes not meeting Rian's. I did not sell it. There is a difference. My ledgers were taken. My debtors were told that their debts were to him now. He will use my old hooks to pull at your new knots. Bram's mouth went flat as an anvil face. So we cut the hooks, he said. Hooks are lawful, the tithe man replied bitterly. That is their favorite trick. He looked at Farathis, and then, for the first time, looked all the way at Rian. I came to witness. I will sign with your circle, because I intend to remember how I got here and why I left. Nail poured tea, as if the world were not balancing on edges. Then sit, she said, with the authority of one who knows how to organize a storm into useful rain. We will answer a spectacle with a circuit. If they go village to village to sell fear painted as feast, we will go town to town, teaching how to eat without being eaten. Rian's eyes went to the standard. The symbol did not glow. It did not need to. It anchored him in the exact weather of now. We plan a route, he said, not to chase them, but to arrive where they are heading. We do not argue with the pageant's song. We give people a tool they can hold that sounds better in their hands. They spread maps made by different hands, and thus honest about different things, currents, customs, the ways pride moves through a market, the places where winter keeps secrets, the towns where law means what it says. The circle's monk wrote as lists formed of their own accord. Trade heat for health, vaults, ovens, smokehouses that heal as they cook. Trade spectacle for skill, a forge lesson in every square, a question in every mouth. Trade command for consent. Lift the standard, teach the phrase, leave a copy of the contract template where the next brave pair can sign. When plans rest, doubt wakes. We are not many, Rian said quietly as dusk blued the edges of the world. They have coin. They have caravans. They have mirrors. Nail sipped and considered. You have consent, she said. Consent scales? Bram scratched the back of his neck. You also have a dragon, he deadpanned. Varathis snorted. A sound like a great bellows amused. They set out 2 mornings later, leaving the first vault, humming like a low good song. The Frostreach people lined the path not to cling, but to lean their warmth briefly against the traveler's shoulders, as if a benediction were a transfer of stored day. The envoy walked with them for a mile, then turned back to write the letters that would keep gates open and knives sheathed. The tithe man did not turn back. He kept walking, until walking became something like penance. The first town on their circuit had already been varnished by the pageant, posters peeling, coin light gone from purses. A wire dragon head bolted above the square that belched oil smoke on the hour. Children pointed, mothers coughed. A boy with eyes like Rian's had, when this began, threw rocks at the gears, because he could not throw anything at bet. Rian planted the standard where oil smoke drifted thin. We aren't here to erase what you saw, he said to the gathered faces. We're here to show you something you can keep when the wagons leave. They taught how to set a kill from broken brick and riverstone, how to build a baffle that turns wood into warmth, and not ash alone, how to ask before asking for more. Varathis lifted the wire dragon head gently, unbolted it, and set it down on the square's edge. He breathed just enough heat onto the metal that the paint bubbled and sloughed off like a lie. Underneath, the frame was plain and honest and could be reshaped into plowshares. Hinges, a new gate for a widow whose husband had not come back from a different winter. The pageant returned at sunset with drums and dancers and an impresario with a hat that had seen too many mirrors. He saw the standard. He saw the wirehead deconstructed and repurposed into useful future. He saw that his audience had spent the afternoon building instead of waiting to be dazzled. He affected sadness the way some men affect humility. "You cannot feed a soul on stoves," he said, arms raised to include the whole town in his pity. "People need wonder. Wonder is not a leash," Rian replied. He lifted a small boy to the anvil and guided his hand with the hammer's haft, the way Bram had guided his. The boy struck, and the square rang with the sound of something becoming. Wonder is a door. Teach them which way it opens. Varathis exhaled a plume-knot flame, a breath that took oil smoke and turned it clean. The impresario's eyes watered, not from emotion. He backed away because men used to selling awe do not know what to do when awe refuses to be sold. Night lowered. The town banked new coals. The contract template hung in the council house, beside a broom and a list of births. The tithe man sat on the well stone with his ledger open, writing a new kind of entry. Debts forgiven where the debtor had built something all could use. Interest converted to heat in the meeting hall. Rian lay on his back in a yard that smelled of new clay and asked the auroraless sky to hold one more promise. The ember did not burn hotter. It learned patience wide as weather. News travels like weather when it is about choice. By the time the circuit reached the hill country, where stones were lichened like old stories, word had outpaced them. A dragon who would not be bought. A standard that meant a different kind of fire. A boy who spoke like a bell and then picked up a hammer. In their wake, ovens breathed easier. Vaults remembered the sun, and a quiet rebellion against spectacle had learned to feed itself. The pageant learned, too. It stopped trying to dazzle where the standard flew and started selling a different product where it did not doubt. Pamphlets bloomed like weeds. Along roadsides, woodcuts of a dragon with a chain in one panel and a dragon with a village in his teeth in the next. Captions arguing that one becomes the other when no prince holds the leash. A lawyerly chorus took up residence in taverns and at wells, asking whether consent was not simply a pretty word for delay while danger grows. Rian felt the weight of that question, the way a smith feels a flaw hidden under scale. He tended to it with attention rather than argument. Each town, the same pattern. Set the standard, ask what the place needed, build the thing that answered, leave the template for binding with words instead of fear. Varathis's patience became legend, not because he did not burn, but because he chose when and why, and because in his presence other fires learned their manners. It could not last without being tested. Tests find the seams. The seam found them on the road back toward Ashford, under a sky streaked by migrating birds whose nap is older than paper. They rounded a bend and came upon wagons jackknifed across the way, canvas torn. Crates spilt, a spill of copper pans clattering like frightened fish. A merchant lay with a wheel across his thigh and a prayer across his lips. From the ditch rose men in piecemeal armor with faces like angles, efficient, unamused, hungry in a way that had nothing to do with bread. Their leader's helmet bristled with cut-down antlers, stolen dignity welded on. "Stand down," he called, as if reciting from a script meant to turn theft into law. By authority of the Prince's Road Commission, this convoy is seized for arrears in public safety. Rian knew the melody, legal violence set to the drumbeat of order. He planted the standard, the flame in the hand stark against cloud. "We'll help clear the road," he said, tone even. "We'll mend the axle, lift the wheel, bind the thigh. No one is seized today." The antlered man's gaze measured the cloth, then the dragon, then the boy. "You carry a banner," he said. "I carry writs." He flicked 2 fingers. A crossbow leveled at the merchant's chest. Another found Rian's. "Consent is not cowardice. Neither is courage rash." Varathis lowered his head until his eye was a yellow sun reflected in the steel tip. "Your writs. Read them," he said, voice so calm the grass leaned closer to hear. Aloud, the man blinked, thrown off rhythm. He unfurled parchment and began. The language was tar, whereas, inasmuch, henceforth, it ended in a snare. Any movement construed as resistance justifies force. That last word had no qualifiers. It rarely does, in writs written by men who think they won the argument when they bought the pen. Bram stepped to Rian's shoulder like a door being reinforced. "We'll be hammered if we choose wrong," he muttered. "Choose right anyway." Rian did not raise his voice. He aimed it. "Witnesses," he called, and the hills answered. Farmers stepped out from hedgerows, where they had been watching the way people watch weather. The envoy, who had caught up with them the previous night, moved from behind a wagon with her seal ribboned to her sleeve. The tithe man, ledger under his arm like a confession, took his place with the circle's monk and herdswoman. The air shifted, not numbers, but eyes. The road became a room with witnesses in it, and rooms like that behave differently when men think to do harm. "Read that last line again," the envoy said, and the antlered man did, tripping this time over the blankness of force. "Now read this," she added, producing a rolled parchment embossed with the city sigil. The contract. The clause Rian had insisted upon. Consent may be withdrawn, with cause stated, with time given to mend what can be mended. "This road is under charter," she said. "These people are under our hearing. Force without consent here is not safety. It is trespass." The antlered man sneered. "Paper," he said, but the sneer was thinner. "I have 30 more like me up the road." "Then bring them," Varathis said, and the world learned again what patience looks like in something that could be terrible if it chose. "We will teach them to read." The crossbows did not lower. In the ditch, a man's finger twitched toward a trigger, because fear trembles in small muscles first. Varathis exhaled a breath so measured it seemed to pass through a sieve. The bolt tips filmed with dew. Leather strings relaxed, not snapping, simply forgetting for a moment how to be taught. The men swore the language of surprise is older than law, and in that breath between intention and action. The circle's monk stepped to the merchant's side. Bram lifted the wheel. Rian slid a lever under the axle, and the envoy put her body between paper and iron. "Choose," Rian told the antlered man, "not a threat, an offer. Help lift, or lift your writs and watch them mean less each time you use them against the living. Choice is the mother of consent and the father of regret." The man spat. He did not help. He did not shoot. He signaled retreat with a grunt he hoped sounded like strategy. His men melted the way cowards do, not in shame, but in habit. When it was done, the merchant wept as men do when they have preserved not just their goods, but their belief that the world can be something else. He pressed coin on them. They pressed it back. "I kneel." "Pay hands. Keep going." The road remembered how to be a road. That night, they camped under a sky that promised rain. Rian wrapped the standard in oilcloth and laid it beside him like a sleeping oath. Varathis watched him with an old animal's tenderness. "You wanted to burn," the dragon said, a statement without judgment. "Yes," Rian answered. "I wanted to be done with them forever." "And yet," Varathis murmured. "And yet I did not," Rian said, a little ashamed, a little proud, very tired. "Then you are learning the temperature of mercy," Varathis said. "It is not cold. It is not scalding. It is exactly the warmth required to keep something alive that might yet choose better." The rain arrived sedately, as if it had learned consent, too. It washed tar dust from leaves and pamphlet ink from stones. In the morning, the road ran clear. Ashford rose from the plain with the stubbornness of home. Roofs patched, doors rehung, the old well oiled by 1,000 draws. A circle's table sat in the square, where it had learned the weight of clauses and bowls of stew. When Rian and Varathis crested the ash-colored hill, 100 heads turned as if drawn by one string. Bram did not wave. He stood with arms crossed, and a mouth that tried not to smile and failed in the corners. They had planned a meeting. They did not plan a welcome. It happened anyway, the way thaw happens to a river, quietly, everywhere, and then all at once. The envoy read the final draft of what the council intended to send to every chartermaster from here to the coast. A template for communities to adopt, adapt, and enforce a grammar of consent that did not require dragons to function, only neighbors. The tithe man signed the circle's ledger with a hand that did not shake even when it should. "For public knowledge," he said, "and for my own." Nail came from the north, with 2 of her people and a string of beads that had remembered winter and survived it. She set them on the table without speech. Gifts like that say what they need to say in any tone. The fishwife from the coast sent cured silver, the mason a box of granite dust to mix with clay so stoves remembered strength. The minstrel, days later, would send a new ballad with a refrain that refused to command. Flame that chooses, we choose to ask. The prince sent nothing. His city's chancellor sent a letter that held respect like coals under ash. We have learned, it said simply, to draft with room left for the living. It included a stamped copy of a new ordinance. No spectacle without consent of those made into spectacle. Penalties enumerated in plain sums, not hidden in flourishes. Rian spoke last, not out of shyness, but out of fairness. He lifted the standard and set it so the symbol faced every door. This is not ours, he said. It is yours. The contract is not ours. It is yours. If we did anything right, it was to refuse to be the only ones who could carry it. He told them of the Frostreach vaults and the whites who learned a new language, of the pageant that had been tamed not by scorn but by tools, of the river fog that had made beauty out of refusal, of the road and the antlered man and the breath that softened iron. He did not tell them he had almost burned. That knowledge belonged to the ember and the night and a dragon who knew how to call a boy back from the cliff of his own power. Then comes the part in stories where the world demands an ending as neat as ribbon. But endings in true things are not bows. They are knots fit to their work. Ashford chose. They ratified the contract as a standing invitation, not a leash. The circle of witnesses expanded to include a weaver, a midwife, a carter whose measures of grain had never been off by more than a handful. The standard was not retired to a hall. It lived by the well, to be lifted when needed and hung back when not, like any good tool. Varathis, whose wounds had become seams of brass light and scale, lay where the square could hold him without tipping. He looked less like a king than like a neighbor, which, in the ancient math of awe and affection, is the greater title. But the world is large, and there were more places than Ashford where law had forgotten how to hold the living without bruising them. The circuit needed to continue without being a parade. It needed to replicate. Teach us, said a girl of 12, with ash on her cheek from helping her mother bank the oven. She stood where Rian had stood months ago, hands unafraid, questions brash. Teach us to build heat that listens. Teach us to speak so the hungry winter hears. Teach us to say no so we can say yes and have it mean something. Rian looked at Bram. Bram looked at Rian. The look was a contract between teacher and student, between older and younger, between those who had weathered a season and those who would pilot the next. Start here, Rian said, and pressed the hammer haft into the girl's palm. One blow for will, one for memory, one for mercy. Count by meaning. Stop when the metal tells you it is time. She struck. The square rang. Varathis closed his eyes and listened, not to the sound alone, but to the resolve behind it. That evening, the envoy brought out the quill of hammered bronze. The circle inked a dozen copies of the contract, then a dozen more, then taught 4 children with good patience how to copy cleanly and slowly. Paper is not iron, but it can hold a shape when stroked by steady hands. When the stars came, they did not look like watchfires anymore. They looked like witnesses. Where do we go? Rian asked quietly, standing in the shadow where the standard's cloth moved like a living thing in a wind that had chosen gentleness. Where we are asked, Varathis said. He raised his head and tasted the night. It smelled of river and kill and animal and ink, of promises written and promises kept and promises still raw and warm from the forge. Will it be enough? Rian could not help it. The question is a cousin of love. Varathis answered the way dragons do when they are honest and kind. Enough is not a place. It is a practice. They left at dawn, not as heroes departing, but as neighbors making a round, leaving behind what could work without them, and taking with them what could not. The willingness to ask, the discipline to listen, and the heat that knows where it belongs. Ashford shrank behind them into the scale where home lives. The road unrolled, not like fate, but like a choice, laid again and again. The fox barked once on the wastes and then twice, and the sound was the same and not the same as the first time they had heard it. In the sky, a line of birds extended like a sentence that could be finished 1,000 different ways and still be true. When the last ember called a human home, It had not asked for worship. It had asked for stewardship. In answering, a boy had become a bell, a village had become a forge, and a dragon had remembered how to be not a weapon, but a warmth. The world did not end. It tilted, and it kept tilting toward a fire that learned, in human hands, to be large without devouring, bright without blinding, and brave without forgetting to ask.